Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting in 2014 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. I could first of all remind everyone to please turn off any mobile phones or other electronic devices. Our first item of business this morning is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business is to continue our Stage 1 consideration of the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill. Today we will take evidence from the Scottish Trade Union Congress and the Low Incomes Tax Reform Group. I would therefore like to welcome to the meeting Dave Moxham of the Scottish Trade Union Congress and John Walker of Low Incomes Tax Reform Group. So a very warm welcome to you this morning. I understand there's no opening statements, so I'm just going to start off with some questions. Now, I'll ask questions to either one or other of you, but please feel free to both comment if you so wish. And the first comment is to yourself, Ms Walker, and you talk about the bill being well drafted, reflecting a consultative approach adopted by the Scottish Government, etc. But you go on to mention that, in your view, there are some gaps in the bill, such as penalties, where powers would be better in the primary legislation rather than secondary legislation as proposed. I'm just wondering if you can give us one or two wee specifics on that.
Well, with the penalties, generally, as a matter of principle, we think that all the principles and the powers should really be in the primary legislation. This is it's partly a matter of principle, it's partly because it gives a greater opportunity for scrutiny and amendment, as far as we're aware, in terms of the parliamentary process. But also, the other thing I would suggest is that by having all the powers in the legislation, in the primary legislation, you're sending a clearer message about the importance of compliance to the taxpayer and to tax advisors, and that compliance is actually important.
Okay, thank you. Do you get any comments to make on that?
I'll just add a general sympathy for that. I think that words are important when one judges severity and intention, but so are figures, and it can sometimes be helpful and helpful at the outset to quantify effect as a way of adding to, as I say, adding to the words in terms of the intention of a bill at its earlier stage.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the areas where there is a difference in opinion between both our witnesses today is in terms of the general anti-avoidance rules. So I'm going to ask a wee bit about that. First of all, again, Ms Walker, you've said in your submission that taxpayers, particularly those who are unrepresented and required to self-assess, are entitled to clear legislation with certainty of effect. Clarity and certainty in the legislation counter tax avoidance, but does it?
Well, on that point, it's more about if you keep the legislation fairly simple and therefore clear. So clarity is a function of simplicity in the legislation. Then actually you're offering fewer loopholes and therefore fewer opportunities for avoidance. Also, if you try and create a more level playing field, so you have less differential between the ways in which you tax different transactions or different types of transactions, then that also means there's less opportunity or less will or desire for avoidance. But it's really a function of keeping it simple, because it means that there's fewer loopholes, fewer complexities. I mean, the point about that is really for the low-income taxpayer. We're really concerned about low-income taxpayers that might get caught in the crossfire of the GAR. That's why we want certainty, because a low-income taxpayer, unrepresented, sometimes they can actually be forced into effectively using what the GAR might consider a tax avoidance scheme, and effectively become the tax avoider, but not through choice. That, for example, might happen with the use of umbrella companies, personal service companies. Sometimes low-income taxpayers are forced into accepting work by either becoming a worker for an umbrella company or forced into setting up a limited company and working that way, and it's the only way they will get the work. And if they don't accept that, then they might lose their benefits.
But surely, you know, if you actually draw it too narrowly, it's the interpretation, as we've seen in recent high-profile cases, is exactly the opposite, that it allows much more room for avoidance, in fact. And I think that's why the Scottish Government is looking at a general anti-abuse rule as opposed to, you know, anti-avoidance rule as opposed to the anti-abuse rule we've got in the UK, because if it's too strictly defined, then the spirit is kind of lost in the precise wording of the legislation.
Well, what we are concerned about is obtaining a bit more certainty. I mean, you could maybe keep it as wide as is currently drawn, but then we would suggest there need to be a few other safeguards for the unrepresented taxpayer in particular. That's who we're concerned with. So that's what we would hope to see, and that might be through ensuring that the guidance is extremely good and is kept up to date. That might, some of the other suggestions that we've made, but it is ensuring that there is that balance.
Okay. Dave, you've said, and I quote, a Scottish GAR should not be narrowly drawn and should reflect elements of the European Union recommendations on tax avoidance. I'm just wondering if you can expand a wee bit on the STC's view on
well, I mean, our very general view is that tax avoidance is now a significant political issue. Now, obviously, when we're designing new legislation, there's an extent to which politics should be carefully dealt with. But our view is that the public perception just now of avoidance and the avoidance to which use is put can potentially affect a whole range of behaviours and a whole range of legitimacies. So people's approach to their benefit payments, their approach to their tax, their approach to a whole range of what we would describe as societal compliance rests on, or partly rests on at least, their view on whether a tax system is fair and being applied evenly and justly. So I suppose that's a general point, just to say that we think this matters in a very, very broad economic and social context. Our view is, and we wouldn't be averse for one moment to looking in detail at what support and mechanisms might be put in place for small taxpayers, unrepresented taxpayers, in dealing with the general GAR, is nonetheless that the two principles essentially laid out within the bill, namely firstly that the intention of the original legislation, the intention of Parliament in terms of designing or allowing to be designed any particular tax planning process is a key factor in terms of whether subsequent avoidance is judged to be acceptable or not. And secondly, a question of financial proportionality, which is whether the planning or avoidance being sought is proportionate in terms of the profit or the tax advantage that is gained relative to the initial measure. Now, thereafter, having established those principles, we think it's entirely reasonable to look at how that is dealt with both in-house by Revenue Scotland and in terms of the support that is provided in terms of potentially early clearing for small tax for small taxpayers. But the principle is very, very important, and it would set the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, in stark contrast to the very narrowly drawn regulations that we've seen come forward at Westminster.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, the EU guidance is that it should be for the taxpayer to demonstrate the arrangements are not artificial, but Section 62 puts a burden of proof on Revenue Scotland, and that's from Unison's submission. I take it you would be of the view that the burden of proof should not be on Revenue Scotland, but should be on the taxpayer?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, thanks. And Unison, it says, would support the introduction of the provision in the bill requiring disclosure of tax avoidance schemes. And they go on to say that the UK GAR panel members are all drawn from the tax avoidance industry, which makes consent to the application of the GAR unlikely in most cases. And they add that if there's pressure on ministers to introduce an advisory panel for the Scottish GAR, it must be done in a transparent way with truly independent members. I take it you would go along with that.
I would go along with that. It's not an entirely analogous comparison, taking your second point first, but we're a great fan of what was once we described as the Industrial Tribunal, in which our members had the opportunity to have their cases heard before somebody who was an employer expert, somebody who was an employee expert, and a third person, and very often that third person brought to the table a general perception of how the workplace should be. Now, the expertise of the two former people were of course, very, very important, but and obviously there's an extent to which any advisory panel would expect to have a requisite level of expertise in terms of its guidance. But returning to my earlier point that the overall principles of this bill and the application of it are a matter of general public concern, we believe that that any advisory panel should be, as Unison say, not only transparent, but drawn broadly enough that there can be some public faith that all considerations are being taken into account.
Do you want to comment?
Yeah. I think one of the suggestions that we made was for an advisory panel with commercial experience. I think it's important to stress there that an advisory panel are just that. They're an advisory panel. At the end of the day, Revenue Scotland would be drawing up the guidance. Revenue Scotland would be making the decision as to what is and is not within the GAR. And the advisory panel are there to advise. So I think it's important that they have commercial experience because otherwise there is a danger that there's a with the way different particularly corporation tax, for example, moves on so quickly, different kinds of businesses, we've seen digital business move on. I think there's a danger that if it's just being decided by people who are not, who don't have commercial experience, who don't have tax experience, then you're going to get incorrect decisions made purely through a lack of understanding. And so that would be our reasoning for having people with commercial experience.
Only commercial experience?
Commercial and tax experience, yeah.
Okay. Just one final point before I open the session out to colleagues around the table, which is Ms Walker, in terms of your submission, you said that there should be a limitation on the power to charge a fee as, for example, a taxpayer not be able to pay using a fee-free method because of some disability. I'm just wondering if you can... I'm a bit confused as to how someone's disability would prevent that.
Well, it's just a slight concern that, our concern is really with safeguards for low-income taxpayers, and our remit covers people with disabilities, low-income workers, migrants, students, pensioners, and there is just a concern that if, for example, it might not be, I mean, that's an example because of a disability, there might be some reason why someone cannot use any other method of payment than a method of payment that Revenue Scotland has decided to charge a fee for. Now, it might not be able to think of an example, but...
What's stopping them doing that?
Well, it might, for example, they might not be able to use, say, for example, there was a fee charged for using a cheque, for using a credit card, and the only method this person could use because of a disability or whatever was to pay by cheque. Then they would be charged a fee for that, but they wouldn't have the option of using a fee-free method. That's just that's more an equality impact concern. Just to be aware that there might be equality impacts to consider in that area. Okay,
I'm going to open the session out now to colleagues. First person to ask a question will be Jamie, followed by Michael.
Thank you, Convener. You both talk of the process of consultation informing the bill and indeed the low-income tax reform route. Say that as a consequence the bill is well drafted. I'm just wondering if you could comment a little on that. You know, what from your perspective, the process of consultation has been and how that's informed the bill?
Well, I'm aware there's been various avenues of consultation. I believe the first consultation on tax management was back in 2012. There's been every 6 months there's Devolves Tax Collaborative, at which various bills and parts of the bill are discussed. I've been involved in various other workshops to discuss things like equality impacts, design of website, for example, for Revenue Scotland. It's all showing, really, the important thing here is that Revenue Scotland and the taxes framework, they're being set up from scratch. There's not really that much, I suppose, experience just from within here in Scotland of having the tax framework and having a tax authority. Not that they've not relevant experience from other situations, but it's showing a willingness to learn from other situations, other experiences. And I think that always, you know, to get the widest possible view is always helpful in developing ideas and developing the system and framework. And I think that shows, because I think the bill is generally well drafted. Yes, there are a few areas where we have, you know, a few little issues with, but it is generally well drafted. I think it stands up well. It's quite clear, and hopefully it will provide a good framework for any devolved taxes and for whatever happens after 2014.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo most of that. Just to add, as I mentioned in our consultation response, that the STUC was invited, along with a range of organisations, to participate in not just the Devolved Tax Collaborative, but also the Cabinet Secretary for Finance's consultative forum. I think what was important about that was that he constructed a mix of people with obviously specific expertise, of which I can clearly state I'm not one, but a range of other organisations, including the Scottish Poverty Alliance, youth organisations, the STUC, and others. And that's been particularly helpful. I think he'd also probably say, or certainly the officials would say, that the fact that Westminster has been going through a similar process, albeit a process that we're less happy with the outcome of, has probably been of assistance as well.
I'm sure you're a valued member of the group, Mr. Watson. Ms Walker, in your response to the convener, you talked about your concern about the GAR impacting on low-income taxpayers, and when you talk about low-income taxpayers, presume you're talking about people on low incomes rather than people who pay a low amount of income tax. They are not necessarily one and the same, of course.
Yeah.
But I just wondered, does this reflect your concern, you know, on an ongoing basis, because you just referred there to further tax being devolved? Because how many such people are likely to actually be caught up in LBTT and landfill tax, realistically?
Well, yes, I mean, for the two taxes, the two devolved taxes at the moment, the impact may be minimal, but there are, I mean, I am aware that there are groups of people that may be affected by Scottish landfill tax that are individual low-income taxpayers, and there are also just because someone is maybe falling within land and buildings transaction tax because they've managed to buy a property, maybe they've sold a property, and they might be property or they might have a lot of property, but they might not have a very high income. So, those people would be our concern.
Okay, that's helpful. You also, in your submission, you talk about how those who are not directly employed by Revenue Scotland could be delegated to carry out functions on behalf of Revenue Scotland, and you say that an explicit provision should be included to set out that a delegatee cannot exceed Revenue Scotland powers when carrying out a function, and also that they should adhere to the charter that's put in place. Can you just, what's your concern here?
The concern here is that, I suppose from experience elsewhere, that potentially when functions are delegated to another organisation, that organisation may not act in a way in which Revenue Scotland might deem appropriate. But I understand that the delegatees are in the main likely to be other sort of governmental organisations, for example, in the first instance, SEPA and ROS. So, and I also understand, as we say, that this is an accepted principle anyway, that they wouldn't be able to exceed the powers. However, again, as this is a bill that is setting up the framework, it's setting up Revenue Scotland. So it's really setting the tone for the Scottish tax system. I think that it's important to maybe make that an explicit provision so that, obviously, although unrepresented taxpayers are maybe unlikely to read the bill itself, nevertheless, if there's something explicit provided for in the law, they are more likely to be aware of it, or an advisor might be able to draw their attention to it and therefore realise that they have rights. I think the danger is if it's not explicitly there, in order for a taxpayer to be aware of their rights, they also have to be aware of this general principle, which may be part of a law elsewhere, but you're relying on the taxpayer being aware of other laws and how they dovetail into the tax system. And I think that's not necessarily the most equitable situation. So that's why we would like it to be explicit. It's another safeguard for the taxpayer.
I have a point related to that, if we have to the delegated authority. I mean, we're not, as you'll see from our submission, against the idea of the delegated authority to SEPA and registers in the first instance. But I think some care has to be taken in relation to the overall guidance and objectives of those organisations. For instance, we had some concerns recently that the regulation bill conferred on SEPA a duty to promote sustainable economic development. We argued at the time that was a slightly contentious position to take, given that the main function of SEPA is obviously to guarantee good environmental governance. Now, our understanding is that Revenue Scotland wouldn't have that expectation, and therefore it's important that in undertaking its delegated functions, that SEPA was adhering, if you like, to those delegated functions based upon Revenue Scotland's objectives, rather than that or other specific ones that it holds within its own remit.
That's helpful. In the Low Income Tax Reform Group submission, you set out, and this has been raised with us by others, that in the Charter, Revenue Scotland should be expected to adhere to their standards rather than to simply aspire to this. We've raised this with the Bill team, and I think they kind of concede that maybe it wasn't drafted appropriately, and they're going to look at that. Presumably you would welcome the fact that they're looking at that again?
Yes, and I am aware that they were looking at that again. So, but it's I mean, really, because the Charter is, you know, the specific duties for the taxpayer are set out in the law, and also the consequences of the failure to comply, and that's why we think penalties should be there specifically. But the Charter is really to set out and frame that relationship between the taxpayer and Revenue Scotland, and so we think it should be expectations on both sides, but it should be providing that balance. So what are the taxpayers' rights and responsibilities, and what are Revenue Scotland's rights and responsibilities, and that hopefully will develop a relationship that is built on trust and mutual respect, and will show that Revenue Scotland will be even-handed when it's dealing.
There should be a degree of equivalence.
Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned your perspective that penalties should be on the face of the bill, and that's the next thing I want to ask, because you both comment on that. This has been raised with others, and I still can't quite see what's really at contest here, because I think you said yourself, Ms. Well, this is an issue of almost of principle, and that's been raised with us by others, but I'm not so clear why it's such a high principle, because secondary legislation has the same effect before the law than as primary legislation. So, and surely what matters is, to the taxpayer, because we talk about certainty as part of this, but the certainty of the system rather than the certainty of what's in the primary legislation or secondary legislation. It's about the system that will affect them. So, is this such a big issue?
Well, I think it should be for Revenue Scotland, actually, and for Scotland, because you want the GAR, which I agree, we agree that there should be a GAR, but this is a bit like having a GAR, because a GAR is about ensuring compliance and deterring avoidance. Well, penalties are more about ensuring compliance, because they're showing the taxpayer what will happen if they don't comply. I think it's also about sending out a message that Revenue Scotland are going to be fair, but not only are they going to be fair, they can be seen to be fair, because the taxpayer will see that if you do this or you don't do this, then this is what will happen. And I know that if I don't do that, I will get that penalty. But I also know if my next door neighbour doesn't do that, they will get a penalty. Now, I know...
That's not clear to me why that's not an issue of whether it's in primary legislation or secondary. That's almost as if they were going to hide the guidance and what the penalties would be, which...
Well, I think
I'm pretty clear they're not going to do that. And
I think if you get
what's the contest here? I'm still not clear.
Yeah, I think if you get a letter from Revenue Scotland saying we are imposing a penalty under the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Act, that is maybe a bit stronger than we are giving you a penalty under Regulation 26 or whatever, because maybe to the general public, I imagine that they think, well, an act, everyone knows that is law. But I imagine some people might not realise that regulations are law. They might just think well, they're just rules. They're not as important as law. So I think it's sending out...
I'm not going to sit here and write letters for Revenue Scotland, but assuming the letter would go on to say, and by the way, if you don't pay this, you could face the full force of the Scottish legal system.
It will,
presumably that's the bit that would cause them concern more than whether or not it says it's in the Act or a specific regulation, I would have thought. I think from my own perspective, if I got that letter, that's what would frighten me rather than where it emanated from in legislation.
Yeah,
surely.
Well, it probably would, but I think it's about sending out this message that compliance it's so important that it has to be on the face of the bill.
Okay. I don't know, Mr. Maltz.
My reaction is one more of preference than principle, and I suspect that many people who've been involved in drafting the bill would probably see it as a question, their current view as a question of preference rather than principle as well. I tend to concur with you in terms of the effect of a letter and whether something is how that's described. I do think that when Parliament comes to look at the primary legislation, that if we're laying out clear principles around avoidance, then quantifying for Parliament the extent to which the bill considers lack of compliance to be a punishable offence and by how much is not unhelpful in terms of framing the overall tenor of the bill, and that therefore to some extent it will help Parliament take a view on the quality and substance of the bill. As I say, it's preference rather than principle, but I think it would be helpful for that reason.
Yeah, that's useful. That's all.
Okay, Michael, to be followed by... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I just add one more little thing? It's just for an example as well of length of time of scrutiny as well. We have had the bill was published in December, so we've had quite a long time to look at it already and make our suggestions and evidence. I believe the regulations are going to be published sort of between April and onwards. so it's a lot less time between publishing and coming into effect. So although they are going to be subject to parliamentary scrutiny, by necessity, they're not going to be subject to as much scrutiny because there is just not as much time for other people to give their views as well as for Parliament to look at them.
Okay, thanks. Michael, followed by Joan.
Up until now, the bulk of the evidence that we've taken, almost all of it, probably exclusively, has been about who's going to be affected in terms of the structures, the functions, and the technicalities around the bill. So we've been more concerned about lawyers and accountants and the organisations themselves. But I think the STUC have, given us a reality check in terms of those who are going to be affected and having to work through the system, the challenges facing the staff. Given the complexities of bringing HMRC, this Revenue Scotland, SEPA, Registers of Scotland. Dave, do you want to give us some examples of where these challenges are going to lie?
Yeah, I'll try and give you a couple of examples. I mean, the first is a general one, if you don't mind, returning to the anti-avoidance principle. If one takes the view that taxpayers, and particularly small and unrepresented taxpayers, are going to need a significant amount of guidance, or at least some mechanisms whereby they are able to test the effect of particular tax choices prior to making a final decision, then ensuring that Revenue Scotland is staffed to deal with that is absolutely vital. We know from a whole range of statistics that have been produced by trade unions and others that one of the problems with revenue with HMRC has been a lack of staffing in terms of actually the recovery of tax, and very clear figures being produced that tax, if you like, the additional tax recovered per employee in HMRC where they are where extra employees have been utilised has been very strong. So there's a general question of Revenue Scotland is going to start from a position with a relatively small staff, with, we hope, a relatively broadly drawn anti-avoidance principle, and therefore the necessity to have staffing levels to provide guidance and then eventually effective recovery under the new system. One of the particular issues that's been raised, and I should say none of the unions that represent people either in HMRC or SEPA are saying that the arrangements, the broad arrangements outlined in the bill aren't workable. But one of the things that will have to be dealt with is obviously there are a number of people working north and south of the border just now on these two taxes for whom either there is no discrete geographical situation, nor are they necessarily working on one single tax. So there is clearly a reorganisational implication in the medium term, something that would obviously grow if further taxes were devolved. Now, as I say, we're not arguing that in any of those cases the transition should be anything other than manageable, but it does require resourcing. It does require a reasonable view to be taken on the number of staff that will be required, particularly in the first few years. And it does require, as you'd expect us to say, a full consultation with trade unions to ensure that that takes place effectively.
My follow-up question to that then would be, because Unison in particular identified the issues of adequate funding of the organisations and the adequate or sufficient protocols and powers to enable the staff to do their work. Should that be in place before Revenue Scotland is up and running and the staff are already working? Should the consultations have already been taking place on that?
I don't think it's possible. I'd be delighted if you could correct me if I was wrong to say that those protocols should be fully negotiated prior to the end of negotiation, but I think it's the end of the legislative process. But we do think that being very clear, both at committee, Parliament, and ministerial level, that is something which is a commitment, and looking forward would be very helpful to us.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this specific question because it came from Unison, and I don't know what your knowledge of their attitude to this is, but they have expressed in the consultation an idea that there has to be, in terms of investigating illegal activity, the power to enter domestic premises, as long as it's done, according to appropriate levels of scrutiny. Do you have a view on that, and can you understand why they would be concerned about that?
I can understand why they would take that view. I would only temper that view by referring to the second part of your response, which is that it would need to be subject to very, very clear guidelines. But I suppose one can imagine, and I'm no expert, one can imagine circumstances in which that might be necessary.
Can I come in on that point? Because I had a look at Unison's response, and I had a little look because I'm aware HMRC do not have criminal powers as such in the primary legislation. What you have is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, 1984, which is then applied to HMRC to give them power to enter and search in certain situations using statutory instruments. And so I would have thought that would be the route to go. My reason for saying that is that the tax law generally, it's a civil law. You have civil penalties, civil for non-compliance. And although obviously you can have criminal activity relating to tax, that should be covered by the Police Act. And also, I think probably the staff may not want that. They may not want to have those powers. You may want a special unit in effect.
The follow-up question I have to that observation then is, would it have to say specifically in this new Act that it was covered by the 1984 Criminal Act, or...?
I think you would need regulations to... I don't think you would need anything in this Act particularly. That would be my understanding. It would be a case of having secondary legislation to statutory instruments to...
That may be something that we could look into and check out ourselves, but thanks for asking.
John, to be followed by Gavin.
Thanks very much, Convener. I mean, maybe I could just start off with one or two points that have been raised already and just seek to clarify them. I mean, Mr Hepburn was going on about penalties. I suppose my gut feeling about why I wouldn't want penalties in the primary legislation is that, having lived through inflation, which was 10 or 15% or whatever, penalties in any figure in legislation got eroded to where it became, frankly, nonsensical. And it's a huge effort to go back and amend the primary legislation. I mean, is it your opinion, could we get around that by just putting an inflation index in the primary legislation, so that at least it would keep going up?
I would have thought in the primary legislation you can then... I suppose you don't have the same process in Scotland as there is in the UK for updating the rates each year, do we? But there might be some mechanism whereby you could essentially put a number in this legislation and then say it's subject to amendment by regulation or something, so that the administration, for making those amendments could be in the secondary legislation.
I mean, the other thing I'm thinking of too is you might have two penalties. One's £100, one's £500, and then you think, well, that's illogical. One shouldn't be so much higher than the other, so you might want to kind of vary them. So again, if they're fixed in primary legislation, it's surely harder to kind of make these adjustments, is it?
When you say fixed, for different taxes or different...
Well, different offences, say, under the one tax. Or...
Well, it might depend on the offence, and I suppose from that respect, it will change once there's different taxes as well, because at the moment we've got two very much transactional taxes. When you've got a tax like income tax, for example, if you get a tax that's sort of annual, then the penalties for that you would want to be very different. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean there's ways in which this bill may need to be changed in future or amended by other laws. Mm-hmm.
So would you say there's a balance then between the clarity of having as much as possible in the primary legislation, but also, in a sense, the flexibility of not having it in the primary legislation? You
need that flexibility to be able to make amendments, and how that is actually done within the legislation. That's probably for the bill team to look at.
Okay, thanks. I mean, back to some of the points you made when you were speaking to the convener. I mean, you talked about clarity and linked to simplicity, and I'm certainly a fan of simplicity. And I think you said there would be less desire to avoid paying tax. Did I get you correctly? Did you say that at one stage?
I think when I said that, it was a case of if you've got less differential in the way maybe different structures are taxed. For example, at the moment, if someone sets up a business, self-employed, they would be taxed at the income tax rates. If they then decide to become a company, but they're still a one-man band, their rate is substantially lower. If there's less differential, there's obviously other reasons for incorporation that are non-tax related, but from a tax point of view, it's obviously can be more efficient to incorporate.
Clarify that, because I mean, I also very much agree with that point. That I mean, sometimes people are making artificial decisions,
Yes.
like being self-employed, when in reality we would all say they probably should be employed.
Yeah,
But it means
I mean,
the employer doesn't have to pay national insurance and things like that.
Yeah, and sometimes that is, as I was mentioning as well, sometimes that's not really their choice either. Sometimes they're being forced into that.
Okay.
Obviously, sometimes it is a choice. Sometimes it's more being forced by circumstances.
So obviously that's something we can't do an awful lot about at the moment, but
No.
your ideal tax system would be one where it was simpler, maybe everybody paid the same rate, so it didn't matter so much whether you were self-employed or not.
Yes, I mean, essentially, yes. I mean, the more sort of, if you want fiscal neutrality, then fiscal neutrality can sort of prevent there being a need for avoidance, or as much of a need for avoidance.
I mean, on that point, I don't know if the SDUC's got a feeling, I mean, it's maybe a little out with this particular bill, but the whole thing about being self-employed or being employed, and there can be such a big tax difference. Are you comfortable with that, or is that something?
We're not comfortable at all with the way that we describe as bogus self-employment is currently operating at a UK tax level. And whilst I accept the point that simplicity is, to some extent can be helpful, I think that what's more important is that clear messages about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable begin to emerge. Now, to an extent, that's an evolutionary process, in particular with the creation of any new tax system or any new tax body. But it seems to me fairly clear that a general anti-avoidance principle could apply and be interpreted fairly quickly in relation to the large majority of cases, for instance, in the one that we've just given on self-employment. And that's more a question of very, very clear guidance and very consistent application of the rules if and when they had to be implemented in relation to any particular tax. So I take the general point, but I think it's more about how the system operates than about the drawing of the rule in the first place.
I mean, we talked earlier too about the advisory panel, and I think you said, Ms Walker, that it was just to advise. And I mean, that makes me think, well, what's the point of it? And I mean, we had you made a point, I think, that people on it should have commercial experience, whereas Mr Moxham drew the parallel with the Industrial Tribunal, where you have one person with employer expertise, one with employee expertise, and one more of a kind of general layperson, member of the public kind of thing. I just wonder how could we replicate that in the advisory panel? Because I suppose my fear is, where does the public who actually want taxes to pay for hospitals and schools, would they be represented on the advisory panel?
Yes, I mean, I think there is probably a place for some variety on an advisory panel. You don't just want 3 people with exactly the same views. That sort of defeats the object of having maybe 3 people on the panel. But I think there's also if you're wanting a proper view of avoidance, then you do need to have some understanding of the business environment in which the company or the business or the individual is operating, or and also some understanding of the tax environment. That's not to say that a lay member might not have that, and they may very well have that experience or that understanding. But I think that it would you've got to be very careful about who's going on a panel, and that they're actually making a valid and reasoned judgment. That would be the point of having a panel, is that they're providing input that maybe the Revenue Scotland don't have certain experience, and they're providing that knowledge and experience.
I mean, I would want to push you on that, because surely then it is valid for a member of the public who does not have any tax experience to look at Starbucks and say they should be paying more tax. I mean, you don't need an expert to be looking at that, do you?
I think you need to have some understanding of a bit more understanding than just of their accounting system or whatever. We can't really comment on an individual case like that, but I think there's also, if we're looking at a GAR, there is that Starbucks is an international company. With an international company, you do have to be a bit concerned maybe about how far Revenue Scotland would have jurisdiction over over their worldwide affairs, which is a consideration.
Okay, right. Mr. Moxon,
I mean, were a panel to be part of the proposed bill, then one presumes it would be for two reasons, being frank. One, because Revenue Scotland staff might be overzealous, or one, because Revenue Scotland might lack, or the particular officer might lack the expertise. They would be the circumstances. Now, I suppose our primary point would be that can be minimised to some extent by good governance and by good and effective training and skills with the organisation. So I wouldn't want to exaggerate, as I've seen some people do, the kind of the difficulties that one would have on a day-to-day basis, where I think that the officers of Revenue Scotland properly trained would be able to undertake their task. But if it were agreed that a panel should be in place, then it seems to us that it's not so much a question of the layperson's view of tax generally, but it's this interpretation of what the intention of the legislation was, because the intention of legislation is political and subject to public perception. It's a far more public event for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to introduce a new piece of legislation that enables additional tax planning, and for that subsequently to be analysed. So it's entirely appropriate that people with commercial experience should judge the proportionality and other effects of an individual's or a company's decision to take a particular tax planning route. But it's also important that there is expertise and also, if you like, layperson's input into that other point, which is, what did the Cabinet Secretary mean by this, and what did the public understand by this when a particular piece of legislation was introduced?
Did you feel that in recent years tax legislation we've made too much emphasis on the letter of the law and forgotten about the spirit of it?
Well, I think there's some extent to which that has begun to change. I think there's been a number of cases recently at a UK level where it seems to me that the courts have begun to take into account more general provisions in terms of intention rather than the letter of the law. But very explicitly, in terms of the way that this bill looks to be drawn, there is a leaning towards the idea that legitimacy comes partly from a judgment as to whether the intention of a particular piece of legislation that's then relied on for tax planning purposes was meant for that purpose. I think that if, starting from a clean slate, if the aim is that that should play a greater part in the future considerations of Revenue Scotland, then that should be reflected in terms of the way that Revenue Scotland acts and is advised by any panel that might be created.
Okay, thanks so much. To move on to a separate issue, I think in your submission, Ms Walker, there's mention of judicial review, and that should be extended rather than restricted and made more available. It talks about the lower courts and tribunals being involved. Could you maybe just expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean there isn't actually a huge amount in the bill covering judicial review. The reason we put in quite a reasonable amount within our response was there's recently been a consultation on the UK level about actually restricting access to judicial review, which concerned us greatly, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we put our view across here that judicial review should certainly not be restricted and should maybe even be extended. Judicial review really, it's one of these remedies that it would apply when a taxpayer hasn't got a statutory right of appeal or they've exhausted all their other remedies, and it's maybe when, with the best will in the world, a tax authority may make a mistake at some point, so an alleged wrongdoing or a failure to act by the tax authority and there's no other remedy available, this would be the route for a taxpayer. Now, the UK Ministry of Justice was proposing to remove the ability or restrict the ability of representative bodies, for example, like the Low Incomes Tax Reform Group, from bringing judicial review cases on behalf of groups of taxpayers. So it would be up to an individual taxpayer, or I mean, it's not just covering tax, an individual to bring a case. Following the consultation, they've now rejected that, and they have accepted that you will still be able to bring such cases. I mean, to give an example, in 2007, it was realised that a lot of pensioners had been underpaying tax because their pension providers had been using no tax codes, so hadn't been deducting tax on small pensions with HMRC agreement. And so each individual didn't owe very much tax over the years, but overall it was quite a large amount. So the Revenue decided to regularise that position, and they were going to write off all the tax apart from the tax for the last 12 months. So this was essentially trying to tax people retrospectively that they hadn't been aware of, because with the revenue agreement, the pension providers hadn't actually been deducting tax. So this was something that Low Incomes Tax Reform Group managed to negotiate. In the first instance, a group like the Low Incomes Tax Reform Group would always try and negotiate first and persuade, rather than going down the judicial review route. And thankfully, we did manage to persuade HMRC that it would have been conspicuously unfair and, in fact, an abuse of power to collect that tax for 2007 and 8. And, in fact, they should only collect the tax from the point when the taxpayer was made aware through their tax code. So basically the tax going forward could be collected. So we managed to persuade them, but that was by sort of suggesting that we would be willing to take a judicial review case. Now, in that instance, no individual would have been able to take a judicial review case, because by the time they would have realised that something was amiss, it would have been too late. They wouldn't have been aware in time, because they would have had these tax codes, and the tax codes weren't due to come out, and it would have been collecting tax that was strictly due, but going back several years. So that's the kind of instance that Low Incomes Tax Reform Group would want to bring judicial review, and it's just a point to try and make sure that there are these safeguards and that people are made aware of its existence. It's publicised properly.
I'm not an expert in judicial review, so you probably know more about it than I do. But I mean, is that something that would need to be in the legislation, or is it just something that's out there anyway?
I think it's out there anyway because it is part of the legal, it's part of the legal system. But it's what we would suggest is in some cases it might be possible for it to be heard in. At the moment, you have to you have to go to quite high court level. We would like to see it extended so that cases can actually be heard in the lower courts, like the lower courts and tribunals, like for example the tax tribunals, and that would actually mean it's less costly, because at the moment it's very costly for an individual to take.
Okay, well, I can understand the point. I don't know if that's within this remit of this bill, but we'll take advice on that. Just to move on to another point, in your paragraph 11, I think it is, it says, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this, it would be sensible for RS Revenue Scotland to adopt the position that tax and administrative burdens should be no more onerous than those in the rest of the UK, and that any divergences should be in favour of the taxpayer. Now, I mean, I would agree with that as far as administrative burdens are concerned. And that goes back to the simplicity and things we were discussing earlier, and I think to some extent we've achieved that because Revenue Scotland are going to charge less than HMRC would. Are you actually suggesting that the tax rates shouldn't be any more onerous? Or
No, this is more to do with things like, the example is the record keeping. In the, I think it's in section 69, there's the taxpayer's duty to retain records for 5 years. Now, the current record keeping requirements for, say, individual taxpayers in the UK is only really 2 years, or a year and 10 months after the tax year. So it's a significantly longer time than the UK system, and it's just for the individual, and particularly the individual unrepresented taxpayer. That's something that it might cause. It's potentially causing confusion, but it's really a case of, fine if you want to choose a different length of time, but that has to really be communicated properly. And how is that going to be communicated? Now, that's maybe not a case for the bill in terms of how you're going to communicate it, but it's by putting that provision in and having the longer record-keeping requirements, you've then got to think about the impact on
so if there were changes being made compared to what people have been used to,
yes,
that should
exactly.
be publicised,
yeah.
Really, yes. Because actually 2 years strikes me as amazingly short, really.
Well, that's just for individual sort of personal taxpayers. If it's a business, it's longer. It's 5 years and 10 months. So.
Okay, and I think the final area I wanted to touch on, under the general anti-avoidance rule, sorry Mr Moxon, I'm aiming most of these at a colleague. In paragraph 28, you say we suggest that section 58, the phrase sole or main purpose, this is under general anti-avoidance rules, is used rather than the wider and less certain main purpose or one of the main purposes. Now, again, we have touched a little on this as well as to how wide the GAR should be. Can you explain why you would want it only to be sole or main purpose?
Again, really, this is just our points on the GAR have really been made with a view to ensuring as much certainty as possible for the unrepresented taxpayer, and so we've made various suggestions. We don't expect them all to be adopted by any means, but we've made various suggestions that we think might assist with making it slightly more certain for the unrepresented taxpayer.
Would you accept, I made this point last week to somebody else, that more certainty is good for a good taxpayer, but it's bad if it's a bad taxpayer?
Yes, possibly. That is, I suppose, yes, it's someone who's going to avoid tax, it probably doesn't really, who wishes to go about that, it probably isn't going to affect that much either way. Someone who just wants to comply, which I would suggest that most people do wish to comply. They may not want to pay, the maximum amount of tax that might be due, but they certainly wish to comply because they want to get on with their business. That's what, you know, the low income tax reform group, we come across people that, you know, they just want to understand what their duties are, what their obligations are. They want to comply. They don't want to find they've been penalised and they've not done a tax return when they should have done. And so it's making it clear what's legal, what's not, where to draw the line. That's what people want to know.
Okay, thanks so much. Did you want to comment on that, Mr. Watson?
Yeah, I would, because I think that if we're providing clarity and if we're going to end up in a situation where we're judging whether an individual has acted reasonably or not, then the provision that exists in the bill is a better way of alerting an individual to the fact that they must take into account the possibility that one of the main purposes is something that should alert them and advise them to either seek further guidance or to take appropriate action to ensure they don't fall foul of the law. So in a sense, I prefer the first formulation as being better guidance for the individual than the one that's proposed.
That's great.
Okay, Gavin, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thank you. I want to explore penalties in just a bit more depth if we can, because my own view is that the approach is somewhat inconsistent, because for 4 failures, namely no return, not paying the tax, having errors or being under-assessed by Revenue Scotland and not paying it back forthwith, basically it's due down to regulations. All it says is there may be regulations for these. However, if there's an investigation and you fail to comply, there is an exact penalty of £300 in the legislation. But if you do comply, but you give some inaccurate, careless information, there's a penalty of up to £3,000 per inaccuracy or failure. So for 4 areas, it's down to regulation. For one, there's an exact penalty, and for another, there's a penalty up to a maximum. I just wonder if you want to give comments on the sort of, in my view anyway, inconsistencies.
Well, I mean, our position we've made clear. We think it should, you know, like, as you're saying, you've got the investigatory penalties are all on the face of the bill. Well, that's what our preference would be for all of the penalties. So that, if that happened, then that would resolve the inconsistency, and that would we would suggest would be the preferable position in terms of encouraging compliance.
So your view is that they should all be on the face of the bill, and Mr. Moxon?
To agree with that, but I'm not clear why. Certainly consistency would be important, and I'm not clear why. Somebody may be able to explain to me why you would, in the one case, state the penalties, but in the other case not. But I haven't yet heard a reason in the various discussions I've had as to why that would be the case.
One for us to put to the Minister when he comes. Okay, so in terms of numbers on the face of the bill, in terms of other points with penalties, is there anything else that ought to be on the face of the bill in terms of the principles behind the penalties or the approach that ought to be taken by Revenue Scotland? Would simply putting numbers on the face of the bill satisfy the concerns that you both raised, or is there something else that needs to be on the face of the primary legislation?
Well, we would like to see things like provision for the amounts of reduction as well. So when someone has, you know, in what circumstances might a penalty be reduced, and by what amounts, or by what percentages or proportions, and the conditions for that, if there are any. Because again, that's sort of suggesting consistency to the taxpayer, and fairness and certainty. There's other things that we think aren't there that maybe should be there, like in terms of other factors that should be taken into account in determining the penalty. So whether a failure is deliberate or negligent, but the amount of the amount of tax involved, the reason for the delay and the length of delay, if it's a delay, a failure to do something on time, for example.
Mr Moxby, anything else?
I haven't really got anything to add to that, to be frank.
Sure. Okay, thank you. We'll go back to the GAR. I mean, obviously we've had lots of questions about that, but just there was something in particular that Joanne Walker, you said early on. I wrote it down. I may have written it down not quite right, but you talked about safeguards for the unrepresented taxpayer. If it's to remain exactly as it is without any of the proposed changes that you've identified, I think you said if it remains as is, you would like to see some safeguards for the unrepresented taxpayer, which is, I guess, different to somebody who has expert representation. Are there any sort of specific safeguards that you think would focus on those who are unrepresented, the group that you're sort of representing?
I think in terms of helping out unrepresented taxpayers, guidance is really key, and guidance in general, but guidance for the GAR. Now, obviously, when you've not had much experience of the GAR and there's not been many cases, that guidance may be rather small, but hopefully that would be expanded, and we would expect that to be sort of continuously evolving. And making that guidance available in various ways, because people may or may not have access to Revenue Scotland's website, for example. And you know, I mean, I suppose, you know, we have suggested one option might be a clearance procedure. If there was a clearance procedure, I don't really see that it could be for one group of taxpayers and not another group. So it would probably have to be universal. So that wouldn't help unrepresented people in particular. So I think really it's mainly making sure that that guidance is there and those clear messages.
It would obviously be helpful for an unrepresented individual to know whether a particular scheme that they might be using had been cleared or not through disclosure, which is why we support the a disclosure provision. I think it's quite important to look at the way that the mechanism we've just talked about might operate. I think it's fair to say that neither you couldn't distinguish between individuals and who are represented and non-represented, not represented within it. And I understand that there would be a concern that a situation could develop in which it was the reflexive action for both underrepresented individuals and represented individuals to simply, you know, pop into the into Revenue Scotland any concern that they have, such that Revenue Scotland becomes an enormous clearinghouse for, you know, for safety first approaches. So I think some thought would have to be given to how that would be constructed. One thought in my mind is that one should, you know, rather than the filling out of form letters, there should be a presumption that somebody using that gives some reason as to why they are availing themselves of the process. So what was the question in your mind when you wanted to find out whether you were potentially at a risk of falling foul of avoidance legislation? So some sort of balance between individuals being able to avail themselves of a process, but some presumption that they would need to go further than just saying, these are all the things that I intend to do in the next year. Can you please take a judgment on them and get back to me? Because I think that would be burdensome and inefficient.
And are you driving it? I'm just thinking out loud here, but are you both driving it? Because obviously, you know, those who represent or tax advisors have said there needs to be guidance as well, and guidance may clear things up for somebody who's well advised. If it's written in legalese, it may not clear things up for an individual taxpayer. Are you then driving at some kind of separate phone line or department or area of Revenue Scotland that would be accessible only by, say, those who are unrepresented? Is that sort of what you were driving at? Or?
Not necessarily. What I'm suggesting is that the facility whereby somebody, beyond advice, I think advice and guidance is one thing, whereby somebody can legitimately ask the question, is what I am proposing likely to fall foul of the law, that provision should exist. Now, As to the separation between a represented and a non-represented individual, it seems to me that if a representative organisation began to overuse such a facility, that Revenue Scotland might want to say something about that. Hence my suggestion that one should have to involve oneself in some form of explanation as to why one is using the provision, rather than simply using it, as I said before, as a kind of clearinghouse for all elements of doubt.
Can I just pick up on, you mentioned the guidance there, and you mentioned it maybe being in legalese. I mean, I think one thing we've always stressed in terms of guidance is that it should not be in legalese. It should always be in plain English. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that it's going to be understandable completely understandable because of by an unrepresented taxpayer, because if it's explaining difficult concepts, they still might not fully grasp whether they are within or without GAR, but it at least gives them a chance because it's in plain English. So I think it's essential the guidance is in plain English. Certainly, HMRC have separate clearance departments. That's a resource matter really for Revenue Scotland, whether they've got the resources, and also to have a telephone helplines. Yes, and again that's resourcing, but they're helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm, to be followed by Jean.
Dave Moxham didn't object when John Mason directed his questions to Joanne Walker in the first instance, so I hope he won't object when I do the opposite. Although obviously I'd be delighted to hear from Joanne Walker as well, but I did think the SGUC paper was interesting. I mean, I think the Low Income Tax Reform Group paper was very interesting as well, but I think it would be fair to say there was a degree of overlap with what we've heard before, where I think in 2 or 3 areas the SGUC was putting a view that we've not heard so much of. So I thought I could take one point from each section of the SGUC paper. I mean, on the general principles, clearly Dave Moxon and the SGUC are quite keen on further tax devolution, including to local government, which is highlighted in section 2.3 of their paper. But I was interested in the last sentence of that section, which I suppose makes it directly relevant to the bill, because you say the possibility that further taxes will be devolved to Scotland is entirely right, that this should form part of the committee's considerations, even though the role of Revenue Scotland in the first instance will be limited. I mean, I wondered whether you felt that that had been taken properly into account in the design of the bill, or do you feel that the bill is really too narrowly focused on the taxes that are currently scheduled for devolution?
No, I think that the combination of being fairly specific in reference to the taxes that will be devolved and the incorporation of the general of the kind of general principles and approach probably provides a vehicle in which further tax change could be accommodated. I don't want to delve too much into other matters, but you'll know that, that the STUC is particularly concerned that almost irrespective of the result of certain constitutional matters that are coming up in the next 6 months, that local taxation is desperately in need of reform, and that and making some reference to the COSLA submission as well. And that it seems likely that at least one of the proposals that might come forward is more income-related issues, potential creation of new taxes, because of course we must never forget that we're not just talking about the devolution of taxes, but the Scottish Parliament already has the power to introduce new taxes of its own. The SGC hasn't got a settled view on land tax, but we think that land tax is an area that should be examined in the next period, as I say, irrespective of the constitutional outcome. And so when you begin to talk about the potential for income-related and land taxation, then it's important to look at the principles of the bill. I think the principles of the bill allow for that to, allow for that to be considered, notwithstanding the fact that any significant further tax change would, of course, involve primary legislation at one stage or another.
Thanks. You want to comment on that or not particularly? Okay. Your next section is on the general anti-avoidance rule. Obviously, that's been touched on already. But again, as has been commented, there is a contrast between the low-income tax reform group who feel that it's rather widely drawn and they would rather have the narrower sole or main purpose, which I think is what's in the UK legislation, whereas you make several points. You don't want it to be narrowly drawn. You want the burden of proof on tax avoidance should sit with the taxpayer rather than the tax authority. You want it to be applicable to international transaction and to include additional EU criteria. And perhaps I can quote two comments from the TUC, which you may or may not agree with. They state that the UK GAR will allow 99% of tax avoidance to continue, and they object to the panel because they say that they're all drawn from the tax avoidance industry. So if we combine those two views together, you may not agree with your colleagues on the TUC, but I mean, it does make us stop and think, because it's a completely different perspective from what we've heard so far, and particularly, I suppose, that figure of the UK GAR will allow 99% of tax avoidance to continue, and that's partly perhaps because of the international transactions issue that you've raised. I don't really know, but I mean, could you sort of firstly say to what extent you think the Scottish arrangements will improve on the UK situation, but more than that, how we could actually, from your point of view, make them better and stronger?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fairly fundamental difference in terms of kind of overall burdens of proof and wording between the two, well, between the proposed piece of legislation and the UK legislation. Now, I mean, the 99%, I obviously, I couldn't be certain whether it was 97, 98 or 99%, but I trust my colleagues, and particularly, I think, Richard Murphy, who actually wrote the submission very well. And I think you're right to point to the fact that, I mean, it's the fact that the UK anti-abuse law will apply to the full gamut of taxes, including income tax and international forms of taxation, that give rise to this, you know, enormously worrying figure. But I mean, let's be clear: the UK legislation is not fit for purpose. Were this approach, and obviously it's hard to be specific, were this approach to be applied to the UK situation, then it's our judgment that that figure of 99% would fall potentially very, very quickly. So it's hard to apply the UK legislation to our position in Scotland, but it's easier to apply the principles of this bill and how they would apply were they apply to the full gamut of taxes in the UK international perspective, and it would undoubtedly be a major advance. And I know that that's the view of the TUC and other experts, that it would be a major advance if the principles of this bill were to be applied at a UK level.
So I wonder, I mean, if Joanne Walker accepts that analysis of the UK GAR, because in a kind of way you seem to be wanting us to replicate the UK GAR as far as possible, which might seem problematic if it was as ineffective as the figures I've quoted suggest.
I'm not sure about those figures, but I wouldn't comment on them. In terms of the anti-abuse versus the anti-avoidance approach, I suppose the anti-abuse rule would provide more certainty for our constituents, the low-income taxpayer, because unless they were actively seeking an abusive scheme, which in general they wouldn't be, because they're often the type of thing that you pay for, then you know, they can just sort of happily ignore it because it doesn't affect them. Whereas the general anti-avoidance rule may, as I say and illustrated earlier, it might actually encompass them unwittingly, and that would be our concern. I mean, in terms of the burden of proof on that point, I think we haven't commented on that because we sort of probably agree with the bill, with the burden of proof being on Revenue of Scotland, partly really because it just provides that bit more balance because as I mentioned before, you know, Revenue Scotland will be drawing up the guidance, and ultimately it is Revenue Scotland's decision as to whether to say, or what, you know, whether to say that someone is within GAR or without GAR, and therefore the burden of proof, I think, falls correctly on Revenue Scotland.
Thank you. And finally, the last section of the SGC papers on workforce implications. I was in particular on the phrase redesign of jobs, and I wonder to what extent that was related to a stronger enforcement role, or whether that was more just to do with the way in which different organisations are going to be working together. I just wondered what you had in mind by redesign of jobs.
Probably all of those. There's a clear suggestion that there would be cross-working between Revenue Scotland and the two specific bodies that are named, and potentially other bodies. And as with other pieces of collaborative working, like the Health and Social Care Bill, we're very clear that in order to maximise the effect of this kind of collaborative working, then going fairly close to the grassroots and ensuring that people have the skills to work together, a kind of joint training and equalisation of skills is very important. But it also refers specifically to the fact that there will be people who are currently working within the UK tax system, within HMRC, who are undertaking enforcement or valuation or other activities in relation to the two specific devolved taxes, who won't just be doing that. Therefore, their jobs will need to be redesigned, possibly in the direction of greater specialisation, possibly in some cases training in areas that they haven't currently got the expertise in. But there's thankfully there's a presumption in the Scottish Government against compulsory redundancy. Any presumption against compulsory redundancy ensures or calls for a policy of skills utilisation and training that ensures that people are effectively used and trained when they're redeployed into new tasks. I mean, it's not an unusual situation, but it's one that you would expect us as trade unions to want to point towards.
Only to say that you obviously mentioned those two taxes, but I suppose the same applies probably to Scottish rate of income tax, which is being administered by HM Revenue and Customs at the moment on behalf of Revenue Scotland, so that might affect workers similarly.
Thank you very much.
Jean?
Yeah, just finally, I wanted to go back to the issue that I think I was probably quite disappointed in a way, that you feel that the penalties shouldn't be in secondary legislation, because it does seem to me that although we are specifically looking at these two taxes that Scotland will have governance over in the short term, clearly there's, it's opened everybody's mind to think about what might be in the future. And I think without exception, evidence sessions have shown that what people see is an opportunity to improve everything. But do you think that it's also an opportunity to change the culture of how we see tax? I mean, we know that well over 90% of people, while they're not happy to pay tax, recognise that they must pay tax and are, as you write both, I think, in both papers have said, that mentioned large companies and tax avoidance is really not to be part of our culture. We really don't like that, and it's seen as it is, of course, hugely unfair. But it seems to me that by having penalties in the first bill, and it may not, it's a kind of psychological thing, I think, it's almost saying that, we will expect that people will kind of bend the law. I mean, I think that there is something to say that here is a new bill, and this is what we expect. And that's what we're doing. We're setting the bar, hopefully, high, not writing so many, or not being so specific, hence the word reasonable through the documents, this is my understanding, so that that we can't be accused of the loophole. If it's not there and it's reasonable and it's expected, then the pressure is there for the tax to be paid. So I suppose I really just want your kind of comment on that there is the presumption. I think we have to have a presumption in a new tax base that people will pay and leave it much more not to the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, then being much more in favour of of tax collection in terms of not allowing so many loopholes by leaving it to the reasonableness argument.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point, and I take your point, and I understand your rationale for saying that the penalties shouldn't be on the face of the bill. I suppose our view would be that actually, yes, most people do wish to comply, as you say, and they don't like to see avoidance, and therefore it's important to put the penalties on the face of the bill, because if I'm paying my tax and complying with the law fully, I want to know that if anyone doesn't do that 5% or whatever that avoid tax or try to avoid tax are going to, or don't comply properly, that fail to submit on time and things like that, they are going to be penalised. And I know that comes through in would come through in the regulations as well, but I think it just sends a clearer message. I can understand that you want to send a different message, a sort of more positive kind of that people will comply anyway. But I think at the moment we are a very compliant society in general compared to some countries. I think we have one of the highest rates of compliance, and I think the danger is that if you don't put something on the face of the bill like this, people might look around and say, well, I'm not sure that people are being penalised when they're avoiding tax or when they're not submitting their tax return. So actually, and these penalties are not on the face of the bill, they're only in secondary legislation, so actually they're not that important. So I'm not going to comply anymore. So I suppose that would be my concern, is that, people want to do the right thing, they want to comply, but they also want to know that if people don't comply, they are going to be punished. And therefore, the way to show that is by having the penalties on the face of the bill.
It's not a psychology that works.
Yeah, but
often, I don't know.
I don't know. I feel like I might be in danger of dancing on the head of a pin if I come in on this any further. I mean, I accept the rationale. I think that to an extent, I think one of the key messages of the bill is that avoidance will be punished, and that's an inescapable fact, however much we want to promote the fact that compliance and better compliance is our aim. It seems to me that if you're saying that avoidance should be punished, then quantifying that punishment isn't necessarily a bad thing to do. And I know that eventually it will be quantified in secondary legislation, which is why I feel we're probably dancing on the head of a pin here now.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, actually, for answering all the questions of the committee this morning. I'm just wondering if you have any further points you want to make before we wind up the session.
Could I say just on the point of reasonableness? As you said, it is spread throughout the bill. And again, that is something that may detract a little bit from certainty for the unrepresented taxpayer. However, there isn't really an alternative to using that word, reasonable. But it just really demonstrates the importance of really good guidance, having good guidance and making sure that people understand what is expected of them. I also think in terms of what is reasonable, it might be worth considering, again, this isn't for the face of the bill particularly, but it's a case of, it's not really an objective test. It's not what does the the average person think is reasonable, but it might also take in aspects of what's reasonable for that particular taxpayer based on their experience, their knowledge, their own competencies and capabilities. So, for example, a migrant, for example, individual migrant, might have different, might have less capabilities in our tax system than a large company being advised by a large firm of advisors. And so what's reasonable for those two different taxpayers might be different.
Okay. Dave? Yeah.
I tend to agree with that approach.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. The start of the meeting, the committee decided to take next item in private, so I now close this public part of the meeting. Okay, thanks. And I'll also call